Wel, noswaith dda a chroeso I bawb I Lyfrgell Genedlaethol Cymru. I'm Rhian Gibson, Director of Communications, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here to the Drum and to the National Library. And a big welcome to those as well joining us on Zoom online. Croeso. In his latest, extremely popular event, Will Troughton, our photographic collection curator and author of Lost Aberystwyth, will look back on how Aberystwyth has changed over the last century. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Will is indeed the Bruce Springsteen or even Oasis of the National Library of Wales. His gigs sell out very quickly, and there's always a waiting list. So you're very lucky to get a seat tonight. It does show how much interest there is in his work and the library's photographic collections. Lost Aberystwyth presents a portrait of an Aberystwyth that has radically changed or disappeared today. I've had a look at the book, and it certainly does bring back a lot of memories. For me, a few of the photographs should read, Lost in Lost Aberystwyth. I got lost in the King's Hall a few times as a 4-year-old. Luckily, my mum Guy always found me. Woolworth, well, getting lost in that wonderful treasure trove was a regular occurrence. Other memories of childhood that appear in this book for me, playing crazy golf, the paddling pool on the prom, chips in the Dolphin, and the post office on Bridge Street. I'm sure every one of you here this evening will experience the same wonderful nostalgia and hiraeth as I did from sharing Will's book. Copies of this great book will be available to purchase following the event. And for those joining over Zoom, the book is also available to buy on the library's online shop, and you can get free postage with the code DEWI25. So now, can I please welcome the library's photographic collections curator, Will Troughton, to the stage.
Well, let's take this off. Thank you very much for coming this evening. As you can see, the title of my talk is Lost Aberystwyth. I did have some notes here, but they've disappeared, but not to worry. Oh, thank you. Just in case. You've deduced, I think, what the topic is from the title. It's Lost Aberystwyth. It's not just, though, about the buildings that have changed. It's also about some aspects of life in Aberystwyth that have changed over the years. If you're not sure where we are here in the title slide, we're in the pier. It's the Pier Cafe, which was created in 1922. They covered over the part of the walkway to create the cafe there. It's now the part that's the inn on the pier. Just one of a number of alterations they made in 1922. They added a soda fountain, a licensed bar, an ice cream stand, and they also remodelled the very end of the pier as well, which we'll see later. But I think if we're going to talk about Lost Aberystwyth, and if we could have something of a tour around the town, I think there's only one place where we could really start such a tour, and that would be with the Old Town Clock at the very top of Great Darkgate Street. As you can see, it was built in 1857, it was demolished 99 years later. It was 60 feet high, and it cost £1,250 to build. And the clock itself was built on the site of a previous building, the Guildhall, which we can see in the illustration there. That dated back to about the 1780s, and it was demolished in 1855 once the new town hall in Queen's Road had been built. The Court Leet, which was a forerunner of the council, used to meet on the first floor, and you can see that the bottom part acted as a small market. If we go to the top of Great Darkgate Street, this is from about 1890. The town clock is on the very left here. You can see there's something for sale underneath it. I don't know. It's difficult to work out what it is, whether it's chestnuts or carrots or potatoes. It's not really easy to see. On the right-hand side, we've got the Gagarthan Arms and Lion Royal Hotel. And that was one of the town's leading coaching inns, and it was, for much of the 19th century, it was the town's major hotel. It lasted as a hotel until 1959. It was then bought by the university and renamed Padden Hall. In 1904, it was the venue for a meeting which led to the formation of the Royal Welsh Agricultural Society, so it has a degree of fame, I think. If you look at Mr. Griffiths, the provision merchant, part of those premises were demolished to facilitate ease of traffic flow sometime in about 1960 or so. If we were to stand on the balcony there, on the portico of the Line Royal Hotel, we would be able to look down Pearse Street, and I've got two views there, taken about 80 years or so apart. One from about 1905, and you can see all the awnings on the shops there. So obviously it's renowned for its sunshine, so obviously they wanted to prevent anything fading. And the other photo dates from 1981. If you look there are still, I think, four businesses in Pearse Street that are still there. The Penguin Cafe is still there. The art shop is still there. There's the small electricians just below the art shop. And then there's the rejuvenated Albatross further down as well. But there used to be in Pearse Street this shop. It was styled as the Italian Warehouse. It was better known perhaps as the Welsh Cellar. It's been a delicatessen for decades. It was kept by the Noyes family. Their son Alfred was quite famous. He was known as a poet, a playwright, and a short story writer. And he grew up in Aberystwyth, but he found fame elsewhere. But between 1913 and 1924, he was a visiting professor of English literature at Princeton University, and one of his pupils was F. Scott Fitzgerald. So if it comes up in a pub quiz, what's Aberystwyth's connection with F. Scott Fitzgerald, you'll know. So you can see there's a wide variety of items for sale. Sprat's dog cakes, Harris's Wiltshire bacon, and Choice Invalid Port. I don't think you can get that on the NHS anymore, but it's now the Abu Dhabi Ice Cream Company. Notice that the street sign at the top says Little Darkgate Street. That was the original name for Eastgate. But many of the tradesmen there felt that by calling it Little Darkgate Street, somehow they were losing out, that people weren't taking the businesses seriously. So they petitioned the council and they came up with the name of Eastgate. So I've never really seen the logic of where they got that from. But near to Noyes, and near in time as well, is Miguel's Tapas Bar. That was there for a number of years. Sadly, it's one of the many businesses, I think, that didn't really survive the COVID epidemic and the lockdowns. So it's now the Bank Vault, which is Aberystwyth's latest pub. It's also a live music venue. It's called the Bank Vault because these premises were originally built as a branch of the North and South Wales Bank, and later on they moved to bigger premises in Great Darkgate Street, and then were properly taken over by the London and Midland Bank. So it's now HSBC. But before Miguel's, I remember it being a youth club, and I think it's also a Pentecostal church as well. And I'm sure it's been many things in between as well. If we move on a little bit, to the very top of Great Darkgate Street, we come to Mr. John Rowlands, the butcher. And the Rowlands family have been butchers in Aberystwyth for a good 140 years or so. Mr. Rowlands retired in 1985, but I have from his daughter recollections of two of their customers. One was a cat that used to come along and be given a piece of lamb's liver, and then a sort of payment would stand guard over the shop. Who or from what, no one seemed quite to know, but everyone was happy. And the other was Rusty, a red setter, who'd come along, and he would lie across the entrance on the step that you can see there, and he would eventually, as he was hindering people coming in and out, he would have to be shooed away and given a bone for his troubles, and he would trot off quite happily. This is the friendly stores in Princess Street. This is this and the photo of Mr. Rowlands' shop were by Gwyn Martin. It's one of three large collections we have of photographs of Aberystwyth, but if you have a reader's ticket, you're free to come in and browse. So the others are those by Arthur Lewis and Pickford's, and some of you may have seen the exhibition, or the Pickford's exhibition that was on recently. And you can see from the friendly stores, if you look at the threshold, you can see at one point it's been two smaller shops, and it's been amalgamated into one. But we'll return to Great Darkett Street and one of Rhiann's favourite places, Woolworths. It opened in 1932 and closed in 2008. Doesn't seem that long ago, but yes, I double-checked, it was 2008. You can see also Mona Lisa just below it is closed, the Clark's shoe shop is closed. And Woolworths is one of a large number of chain stores that were at one time on Great Darkett Street and have disappeared. I can think of Hodges, Foster's, Burton's, Dorothy Perkins, Thornton's, Dixon's, Curry's, H. Samuel. They've all been and gone. And the library does have a copy of a gold map for 1977. Gold maps show not just the business premises, but they list the occupants of the premises as well. And there's only one shop that is on the gold map from 1977 that is still on Great Darkett Street. If I remember, I'll tell you at the very end, so you can try and rack your brains and see if you can work out what it is. Just below Woolworths, we had a post office, and that's the interior. They wouldn't let me take a photograph of the inside for security reasons, even though it was about to close. So I just took that from the door anyway. So the post office opened in 1906. If you look above it, it says Post Office 1901. That's actually an allusion to the coronation of Edward VII, who was crowned in 1901. And if you want to, you can still see a statue of King Edward VII above the Ceredigion Museum. If you look on the Bath Street side, you can see Edward VII is looking down over Aberystwyth. We're going to divert slightly, and we're going to go to Corporation Street and the Cardiganshire Joint Library. Opened in 1906 with a grant of £3,000 from the Andrew Carnegie Foundation. Andrew Carnegie was Scottish by birth, but he made his millions in the steel industry in America, and he was something of the Bill Gates of his time, really, and he gave a lot of his money away to philanthropic causes. And some of the conditions that came with the £3,000 for the library were that the council had to spend 10% of the money that they were given each year on maintaining the library and paying the staff and ensuring there was free access to all. So thank you, Mr. Carnegie. The library closed in 2012. I remember going there as a small child, and often as a small child you're told that you have to be seen and not heard. But it was obviously a place where adults had to be seen and not heard as well. And it always smelled of furniture polish. I remember that too. But I do like the Art Nouveau tiles on the stairs that led to the reference room. We've jumped to the bottom of Penglice Road. Here we have the Royal Cardigan Artillery marching. They're on manoeuvres of some sort. I've never been able to find out exactly what the occasion for this is. It dates from around 1904 or so. They did used to march each Sunday up to St Michael's Church, but I presume that they're not going up to the church because they've got their rifles with them, and I don't think they would have bothered taking their rifles to St Michael's. On the right-hand side there, we can see part of the toll gate. Up until 1889, that collected tolls, depending if you were going to Llanbadarn or Penglice, you had to pay a toll going on each of the roads, but the tolls were abolished in 1889. This general area had quite a lot of sort of light industry. The whitewashed building, the large whitewashed building, you can see that was 4 cottages when this was taken, but previous to that, it was an iron foundry kept by Mr. John Sylvanus Williams. There was also a sawmill in this area and a blacksmith's. You can look at the toll gate. There's a view of it here from 1930. Being the North Toll Gate, it gave its name to Northgate Street. And obviously we had a South Toll Gate as well in Southgate near Penparcay, and that's the one that's been dismantled and taken to St Fagans. This toll gate was taken down in 1938. It was regarded as being a hindrance to traffic. But you can see that Mr. Jenkins has converted into a sweet shop and tobacconists. Near him, another lost building is T Melin, which stood at the bottom of Penglice, approximate at the entrance to Cai Melin. And initially it was a small holding. Later on, for a few years, it became a public house called the Raven, which was quite convenient for the militia who were stationed locally. It wasn't the best run of public houses. It's frequently to be mentioned in the few years it existed in the petty sessions. On one occasion, a policeman walked in and found the landlord and 3 gentlemen enjoying a drink well after hours, and the landlord's excuse was that he only had 1 clock and that it was at the Menders. So he didn't get away with it. It was also just outside the boundary of Aberystwyth, so it was at one time used as a slaughterhouse as well. I came across a reference when the purpose-built slaughterhouse in Park Avenue was built. Many of the butchers protested at the fees they were being charged, and they refused to use the council's slaughterhouse, and so they brought their animals to Tŷ Melyn to be slaughtered. We'll move on from Tŷ Melyn. Nearby, the militia barracks, built in 1867, along with the town clock. I think 2 buildings that should never have been allowed to have been demolished. It was built really for the staff of the barracks and the officers, the staff sergeant, the adjutant, the bugler got his own apartment. There were 13 apartments for members of the militia and their families, each with 6 rooms, so it was quite commodious for the time. The tower in the middle stood above the powder room, and the thought being that should there be an accident in the powder room and an explosion, that the explosion would go upwards rather than going across. So I don't know what the difference would have been had it, but anyway, it didn't, so it was never tested. So you can see above that, you can see the fields below Penglais Woods there. Those are all, of course, have been built on now. So we'll move back a bit to North Road, and this is the North Road School. Built in 1866. You notice the barracks were built in the 1860s, and the 1860s was mainly because the railway arrived. It was a time of great development in Aberystwyth. The headmaster's house that you can see on the left there, that's still standing, but the North Road School itself was demolished in 1987, and Llys Hen Ysgol now occupies the site. It was built as a free school, so it was connected with the established church. It replaced an earlier smaller school which stood in Northgate Street. But by the time, I'm not sure exactly when it stopped being a school, but certainly for many years before it was demolished, it was just being used by the Education Department as a storeroom. And almost next to the North Road School was the old North Road Infirmary. Originally it was built in 1888 with money from the Joseph Downey bequest. Joseph Downey came to Aberystwyth as a bank manager, but he also had his own wine and spirit business, hence Downey's Vaults public house, but he left money in his will for the infirmary, or for an infirmary to be built. Initially it had only 20 beds. Obviously it's been extended since, and you can see the Art Deco part that was added on in 1923. Again, subsequently demolished in 1998. But notice also the greenhouses and the allotments that belong to local greengrocers in the foreground, and the wonderful cars. If we go a little bit further along North Road on our tour, we at one time would have come to the College Hall. This stood between North Road and Queen's Road on an area that's now, I think, just a small lawned area next to the bowling green. It was built to celebrate 50 years of the University College of Wales, Aberystwyth. It housed 2,500 people. It was used for concerts, exhibitions, conferences, as we see here, the National Union of Teachers. It also served as an examination hall. But as you can see, it was built of wood, and the roof was just of tarpaulin, so it was quite a frail structure. And on August 13th, 1933, the inevitable happened. It seems it went on fire due to spontaneous combustion. It doesn't seem that it was due to negligence of any sort. But within a couple of hours, it had been razed to ashes, and it was just the brick foundations that were left standing. If you move just a bit further along again, this area, as you may well have noticed, there's quite a lot of churches and chapels. St. Winifred's is there. I'll just highlight 2 of them. The first is Shiloh, which you can see up there with the 2 towers. It was built in, I think, 1863. There were problems almost as soon as it was built. It was built on very marshy ground. If you recall, the Sandmarsh Cottage, which gives you a clue, is just a little bit further along Queen's Road. And the original front started to come away from the building, so they had to build those 2 towers instead, and they thought that would stabilise it. But in fact, even as they were building, they realised that one of the towers was going to be too heavy, and so they had to truncate it. So what were supposed to be 2 identical towers had to be left as they were. They managed to survive up until 1956, and then again there were problems because of the nature of the ground. And the local architect, Mr. Ponsell, came up with the new frontage there, which you can see obviously it's a lot lighter in weight. It wasn't going to cause the same problems as the others. But I recall going to the school room there to donate blood on one occasion, and just lying on my back and looking up. And there were no right angles in the building at all. You could see it had twisted every which way. So it seems inevitable that it had to be demolished, and it's now the site of the Moorland Faith Centre. At the junction of Bath Street and Queen's Road, there was an English Wesleyan Methodist chapel. I've been told that it was very unpopular with funeral directors, because if you look at the entrances there were steps leading up to both entrances. So any coffin would have had to have been manhandled both up and then later down the steps. So for that reason, it wasn't particularly popular with funeral directors. When it was founded, one of the leading lights of the chapel was a gentleman called Robert Doughton. He was later a councillor. He was a mayor on 2 occasions. He was a Sunday school teacher who would preach from the pulpit. And he was also the sort of self-appointed caretaker, and even kept a bag of tools in the basement just in case that something needed to be repaired. Around on the Queen's Road side, there were steps that led down to a basement, and this was a schoolroom. But from February 1940 up until June 1944, it served as a canteen for servicemen, and it was very proud of the fact that it opened every day between those dates for 13 hours every day to provide them with cups of tea and so forth. I'm going to move on a bit now. Still on Queen's Road, the lifeboat station. Again, built in the 1860s, built in 1861. Now the building is still there, but obviously it's no longer a lifeboat station. And if we look at the next sequence of pictures, you can see exactly why that is. These are showing the lifeboat being launched with the tractor. First of all, being dragged out into Queen's Road. Then it had to negotiate the corner from Queen's Road round into Bath Street. It then had to negotiate Bath Street, and you can see even in the 1950s there are 2 rows of cars there. So you just think of the damage you could do now with something like this. Once it got to the top of Bath Street, then the tractor had to reverse into Terrace Road, so past Aston's, past Peacock's and the Coliseum. We know this is 1952. You can see the film advertising John Wayne and the Quiet Man. Came out in 1952. It features John Wayne speaking with an Irish accent, and it's actually not recommended. But then once they'd got the lifeboat in position, it then had to be pushed down onto the beach. And then, of course, afterwards, there was the less glamorous part of actually retrieving the lifeboat and reversing the whole process. Now, in 1861, when the lifeboat station was built, the lifeboats would have been pulling and sailing lifeboats, and they were there mainly to save people who were in distress on ships out at sea. However, by the 1950s, things had radically changed. The type of rescues they were likely to be involved in would have involved perhaps pleasure boats, perhaps fishing boats, or people who were stranded under the cliffs. And obviously you can see a boat like that is wholly unsuitable for that sort of rescue. So in 1964, the last lifeboat, this motorboat at Gwilla Wren, was taken away. And since then, the RNLI have used inflatable lifeboats which have been stationed in the harbour. Obviously a far more sensible method of operating. I will come on to the King's Hall in a bit, but you can see it there in its glory. But we'll go on to the Queen's Hotel. Again, built in the 1860s, as much of Aberystwyth was at the time, it represented the northern extent of the promenade. It had 100 bedrooms, drawing rooms, billiards room, coffee rooms. Amongst those who are known to have stayed there, David Lloyd George, Amy Johnson, the aviator, and H.G. Wells. I'm sure I've come across a reference to Edward Elgar having stayed there, but I couldn't find the reference, so don't quote me on that one. But during the 1930s, it had an American bar which had an impressive cocktail list. I've just listed 3. It had a Monkey Gland, sidecar, or a port wine fizz. Each of those could have been yours for 2 shillings, 10 pence, which according to the Bank of England inflation index works out to about £6, which is actually not an unreasonable price. Now, I mentioned already the 1860s as being a time when there was a lot of development in Aberystwyth, and when you think the old college was being built, the Queen's Hotel, the pier, the barracks, the school in North Road, we've seen the lifeboat station, a number of chapels. So with all these building works going on, there are a large number of labourers coming into the town. There are also the navvies associated with the railways. Also, there were many people who thought, right, the town's going to be busy, I'm going to open a pub. So there were one time 70 pubs in Aberystwyth. So it was really, in the 1860s, something of a Wild West town in some ways. And I came across one incident that Mr. John Lee was an Irishman. He was working on the old college, and he'd had a few drinks on a Saturday, and he wanted another drink in the Angel. And they refused to serve him, and they barred him, and they shut the door in his face. And he took great umbrage at this, and he marched over to the market hall. He picked up a basket of turnips, and then proceeded to hurl them through the windows of the Angel. He broke 9 windows in the Angel. He ended up in court. He was to be fined 17 and 6. The main prosecution witness was Lewis Lewis, who owned the turnips. And he was threatened with a fine of 17 and 6 or 14 days hard labour in Cardigan jail. Fortunately, his contractor, his boss, Mr. Jesse Baker, opened up a fund amongst the workmen, and they had a whip round, and they managed to get the 17 and 6 together, and hopefully Mr. Lee learnt a lesson. But we can move along. Up to the 1950s, I think, here, taken from the top of the King's Hall, looking along the prom. But what amazes me is the number of deck chairs and how popular they were. And that's something that seems to have died to death. They were certainly there. I remember as a child, the deck chairs were there, but certainly by the 1980s, they seem to have disappeared. The bandstand, you can see, it's been remodelled a number of times, but the base of it is still there. You can see there are concession stands on the prom. There are 2 there, perhaps selling ice creams or drinks. And you can probably just make out a radar mast on the top of Constitution Hill. That was one of 2 that stood there. I'm still trying to work out or find out if they are dates from the Second World War or from the Cold War shortly afterwards. I've seen a photo from 1948, which shows one of them, so they were definitely there by 1948, but how many years they were there before that, and it's difficult to say. But we will move on. Oh, oops, wrong way. To this building, the Waterloo Hotel. And this was the precursor of the King's Hall. It was Aberystwyth's biggest hotel. It had 107 bedrooms, so it beat the Queen's Hotel by 7. It had 2 dining rooms, a drawing room, coffee room, billiard room. It had grown from one house called the Waterloo, which had been built in 1815. And by the time this postcard was made, it had taken over 9 different buildings altogether along the promenade, also along Terrace Road. I'll draw your attention to this area here. I think it was the 26th of August of 1919. 3 members of staff went down. It was 1:30 in the morning. They went down to an area around here where they usually went to get their food, and they discovered there was a fire in one of the beams. They attempted to extinguish it. They were unsuccessful, and it melted the adjacent gas pipe. The gas then ignited, so they vacated the premises and attempted to warn everybody. And half an hour later, by 2 o'clock, the whole of the front on this part of the building was ablaze. They managed, so they thought, to get everybody out. This is the scene a little later that night, captured by Mr. Pickford. Obviously hand-coloured, it wasn't an actual colour photo. And the day after, this was all that was left of the Waterloo. The number of things about this that sort of surprised me. Firstly, you've got this unsupported wall here, 4 stories high, with probably very shaky chimneys on the top, and you've got crowds of people underneath it. You can see on the balcony, you can see there are sheets that have been tied for people who escaped over the balconies. There was a concert party staying there, and the tenor had to actually escape with the soprano on his back and climbing down the sheets on the balcony. So there were some quite hair-raising escapes. It was thought that everybody had escaped and that everybody was accounted for. There obviously can't have been really a guest book or anything as we would have today. But as weeks went by, friends of a lady called Miss Cheadle were concerned that they were unable to contact her, and nothing had been heard from her since she checked into the Waterloo on the night of the fire. So it's assumed that she perished in the fire She was described as being 65 years old and quite frail. So there was perhaps one casualty. The site then remained empty for many of years. It was used for amusements by Mr. Tewson, who we'll hear of later. But there were plans to build the Hotel Majestic on the site. Nothing came of that. The Grand Casino Hotel, again, nothing came of that. And eventually the council decided they would build a municipal hall, which we see here. It was renamed the King's Hall in 1935 in recognition of King George V's Silver Jubilee. And it was, you can see it's a marvellous sort of Art Deco building. The steps on the right there, they led down to what was called a palm court. In fact, it was let out to Mr. Tewson for his amusements, and it was an amusement arcade for decades afterwards. You can see it's a fine looking building. It housed a total of 1,500 people for concerts, 250 of which were on the balcony. It came into its own really in the Second World War when there were lots of servicemen in the town. There were many dances held there. The BBC Home Service broadcast live from there. Later on it was used for conferences, for exhibitions. It was used by the university as an examination hall, especially after, of course, the college hall had burnt down. It was used for graduation ceremonies. For people of my generation, the Rolling Stones played there, Led Zeppelin played there, the Kinks played there, Fleetwood Mac played there, and as a 10-year-old I remember sitting through interminably long Gilbert and Sullivan operas. I've never forgiven them. Just across from the King's Hall, you could go for trips in the bay. And the late 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, you could have gone in the likes of Lizzie. It was in fact a fishing boat which would have been hastily scrubbed out at the end of the fishing season, ready for the tourists, which were a far more lucrative catch. You can see, looking at the Lizzie there, you can see every one of those people is wearing a life jacket. There's no hint that the boat could possibly be overcrowded. But overcrowding was quite common at the time. I think, to be fair to the boatmen, their season was quite short and they wanted to capitalise on it. But the fallibility of this type of boat was shown by the Lizzie on one occasion. She was entering the harbour with a full load of passengers and she struck the stone jetty. She became uncontrollable. A couple of gusts of wind got hold of her and pushed her onto the trap, that stony area to the north of the harbour. Waves started breaking into the boat. People started screaming and shouting. Apparently some fainted. Everybody was rescued by some of the other boats. The other boatmen came to their aid. But it did show the fallibility of this type of boat. And of course, being powered solely by wind, if it was a calm day, then the boatmen were out of luck. There's nothing they could do to take people out. So this really precipitated, I think, the rise of the motorboats, such as the Kenilworth that we can see there, the AB40. And these, again, at least they could be steered properly. The same problems of overcrowding and lack of life jackets seems to have pervaded them as well. But by the 1920s, there's sort of a second generation of motorboats. And you can see here we've got Pride of the Midlands at the bottom, and Worcester Castle is a sister vessel. They were bigger and they were faster. Between the two of them, they could cater for 300 passengers. They had wet weather accommodation and they had conveniences. And being bigger and faster, they weren't confined to trips in the bay. They could offer trips up to Abu Dhabi or up to Barmouth as well. So they really took over from some of the smaller motorboats. I think the last one to operate was the Bounty, which carried on until the 1970s or so. We did have a very brief renaissance in 1993 with the Aquabus, which was a 22-seater hovercraft, which offered trips in the bay, and I think offered trips to Abu Dhabi and to Borth. I went on it on one occasion, wanted to see what Aberystwyth would look like from the sea. I was very disappointed as there's so much salt in the windows you couldn't see out of them. So, when last heard of, the Aquabus was out in the West Indies operating a ferry service. If we move up a little bit to another of Rhiann's favourite spots, we come to the paddling pool. It opened on 3rd of August 1957, the week after the Royal Welsh Show had been in Aberystwyth, and if you recall from the exhibition of Pickford's photos, it's when it was also flooded. So this must date from about the same time. If you can see the pier where it says cinema, cafe and dancing, that's the area that was covered over in 1922 to see the cafe that we saw in the title slide. But then also it's incorporated the cinema. we can move along the promenade a little bit and we come to Castle Grounds and we can see this view of the pier. I mentioned earlier how they remodelled the pier in 1922 at the end of the pier, and you can see the structure that was placed there instead of the small pavilion that had been there previously. That lasted until 1938 when there was a ferocious storm in January of that year, and the end of the pier was washed away. If you count from the pavilion end, if you count 5 pairs of pillars there, that's where the pier now ends, just opposite the far end of the Queen's Hotel. Somebody showed me a photo just earlier this week. We had a particularly high tide and therefore a particularly low tide this weekend, and someone had been out at the end of the rocks, and you can still see where some of the pillars had stood at low tide. If you pop up to St Michael's Churchyard, this is from a stereograph from about 1880. Burials started in the churchyard in the 1780s, so by about 1860 it was pretty much full, and that's when the cemetery in Plascreeg opened. But it was sort of semi-derelict and overgrown for many, many years, and then by 1973 the council decided, quite controversially, that they were going to landscape it, and as we know, they've laid the slabs out around the sides, and there's a large green and a smaller area with gardens in. When this work was being undertaken, there were a number of lurid tales of human remains and items being unearthed, but there seems to be no evidence for that. But the workmen were somewhat surprised. They did seem to find quite a lot of bones, which they weren't expecting. Do you remember I mentioned Rusty the Red Setter? We used to go to Mr. Rowland's for his bones. Can you see where we're going with this? In fact, it was Rusty's treasures that they were unearthing. And so each time the workmen found something suspicious, they would have to take it over to Mr. Rowland's to see if he could identify it as being an animal bone. There is a sequel, really, to the story. In 1990, a cable was being laid through the old churchyard, and the workmen came across a vault which still contained 4 coffins. You can read about it on Covline, the Ancient Monuments website, but one of them, it seems, was either iron or lead, so I think they didn't want to take any chances, and I think they sealed it up pretty quickly and diverted the cables. If we move along a little bit to the area under the wall there, we can see on the castle. This has had a number of uses over the years. It was, for many years, there was a small pavilion there where the Pierrots used to play. They had previously occupied a part in front of the gatehouse in the castle, but obviously having their own pavilion was better. They were up above the audience and also protected to an extent from the elements. By 1923, that had disappeared and the putting green opened. Again, like Miguel's Tapas Bar, I'm afraid that seems never to have recovered from the COVID outbreak, and I don't think it's been in use ever since then. So I don't know if the council have any plans for it, but it's a shame. It was a nice facility. It was fun to play on. Likewise, the Crazy Golf, that's currently at the contractor's compound next to the old college. So I suspect we won't see the Crazy Golf again. And the castle grounds themselves have hosted a number of different events. Most obviously, perhaps the Gorsedd ceremony for the National Eisteddfod when it's been in Aberystwyth. More recently, it's been used for Castell Rock, for a rock festival. I remember watching an outdoor performance of Shakespeare once and almost freezing. But in the 1930s, it hosted 2 pageants, one in 1934 for the Nanteos Cup, based on the legend of the Nanteos Cup. And in 1935, there was a peace pageant there which incorporated a cast of literally hundreds, as they involved all the local schools dressing up as representatives of different countries. Moving along, if we pop around Castle Point, we come to Aberystwyth's first paddling pool. This was built in 1917. It was the brainchild of someone we've already mentioned, Councillor Robert Doughton, who we mentioned in respect of the English Wesleyan Methodist Church. It was his idea to build this pond, and he said in an interview with him that one of his most difficult tasks was persuading his fellow councillors that this should have been built. During the years it operated, it was destroyed by the same storm as took away the end of the pier in 1938. It seems to have been immensely popular. It was self-maintaining because, of course, it was below the high water mark, so the tide would come in and the water would be changed twice daily, so it didn't really need any maintenance whatsoever. Sadly, as I say, it was washed away in 1938. I found council minutes in 1960 that talked about rebuilding it, but nothing was ever done about it. I could make a pun and say nothing concrete came of it, but that would be below me. I think we should move along perhaps to the harbour, which has changed a great deal. This is from about 1910. I've tried to identify the two vessels, but not had any luck so far. You can see there, just on the right-hand side, what had been a lead warehouse and quite possibly a smelting furnace as well, is looking very derelict. I'm not quite sure what the vessels are there for. They could have been there to unload a cargo of timber, or they could have been there to collect lead ore. Either would have been feasible at the time the picture was taken. You can see the roof of the Sunday school in Trevechan that was built in 1896, and there's a small steamer that you can see moored in the harbour as well. Had you braved a trip on the Lizzie, you could, if you wanted, go on Mr. Teddy James's ferry. He used to run a ferry service from the small beach near the RNLI slipway over to the end of St David's Quay, where there was a ladder which you had to climb up, so it wasn't perhaps for everybody. If you made it to the other side, then you could have refreshments in the ferry cafe. The building itself was there till about, I think, 5 years ago, but it's been demolished, and there's a very nice swanky house on the same spot now. And if you look at the harbour as it was in 1985, that's about 10 years or so before the marina arrived. There you can see there's the number of buildings that have disappeared. The fire station has been completely rebuilt, and their practice tower has been demolished. The other side of the road you can see was the Welsh Brewers premises. That's all been demolished and flattened. And just to the left of the practice tower, you can see there's a shed there with a slipway. And that was the premises of Williams Brothers, who were local boat builders. The business was in operation from about the 1880s, but not always on the same premises. And they were going until 1959. They built a number of fishing boats, pleasure yachts. They were very active in the Second World War. They built 400 lifeboats for merchant vessels. And some of you might remember a gentleman called Mr. Reg White. He had been a steward on merchant vessels on the Atlantic convoys during the Second World War. And he told me that on one occasion they had a particularly rough passage over to Canada. They lost some of their lifeboats, and they were given replacements, one of which had been made by Williams in Trevechan. This is the last of their boats that was to be seen in Aberystwyth. It was called Ynys Enlli. I took this photo about 20 years ago. I've been told that the vessel was sold to new owners in Ireland, so I don't know if it's still going or not. But apart from a boat building yard, Trevechan, being one of the poor areas of Aberystwyth, had a number of sort of substandard housing. And from the 1920s onwards, there were moves to get rid of some of the substandard housing. Council houses started to be built in Penparcay to replace some of these. But we can see some examples here in Trevechan. We've got Lime Lane there, and you can see it's backing directly onto another building, so there's been no ventilation at the back. Many of these properties were small, quite possibly damp, and likely to have had running water. So one by one they disappeared, including the two whitewashed cottages that you can see in the other picture as well. Amongst those that were demolished, but a little later on, was Rheidol Place, which used to overlook the harbour. Again, that was regarded as being substandard. The two rows of houses there, they were, I think, demolished sometime in the 1960s or so, and eventually flats built on the site. Which brings us along to Bridge Street. Three views of Bridge Street. A marvellous view by Mr. Gwyn Martin there, sort of chiaroscuro, reminiscent of Henri Cartier-Bresson if you're into photography. And otherwise, three views of Bridge Street. We've got the Bridgend News there, that was kept for many years by Basil and Sandra Evans and then Derek Gwenda Edwards. It was built as a pub, as a tavern, the Freemasons Inn, by a gentleman we've mentioned before, Mr. Jesse Baker, who was one of the contractors on the old college. And he came from the Midlands, and he noticed that there were no brickworks in Aberystwyth, that people weren't using bricks to build. Well, why would you? Stone was free, why would you? But so he set up a brickworks on Waun Fawr. It wasn't very successful, so he bought up that plot of land between Bridge Street and High Street there, and he built that row of of houses there, which for many years was known as Freemasons Row. So, and then you can see we also have the small sub-post office that stood in Bridge Street. There's also one at one time in Northgate Street as well, also one out at Llangawsai. And then this brings us finally to Mr. Robert Doughton, who we've mentioned before in connection with the paddling pool. That was his shop at the top of Great Darket Street, overlooking the town clock. So I think perhaps the last word should really rest with him. Thank you very much.
Well, diolch yn fawr, Will. I could hear that people really enjoyed that. So copies of Will's book is for sale outside, and the author is very willing to sign them. And I'm sure if anybody's got any questions about some pictures, I hope you won't be here till 12 o'clock at night, but I'm sure Will be willing to answer. Just to quickly say, a couple of events coming up in the library. This Friday, in Focus, Women in Welsh Art, panel discussion here in the Drum as part of the Peter Lord exhibition, No Welsh Art. And also, if you've enjoyed this, Peter also does guided, curated tours of the exhibition himself. They take place first Wednesday of every month at 1 p.m. and 3 p.m. So if you're interested, please take a look at our website or actually mention it to a member of staff who's here. So now, thank you very much for coming. I know you've enjoyed yourself, and thank you even more to Will for his latest sellout gig.
The shop that was on the gold map in 1977 that is still in Great Darket Street is Claire's, the sewing and wool shop, if you hadn't worked it out.